Hey, I'm just trying to see if I can explain what happens in this thing. They say that teaching someone else something is the best way to know how well you understand something yourself. So I'm going to try to explain what happened here without taking the whole course like David did. And great course, by the way. Um, so what we've got over here in the app.js X, we're creating a component called app, which is an extension of the React component. All right, and we're saying that it's going to have some props, which it gets from component through super props. Then we're assigning our app component with some state, and we're saying it has basically a variable called deadline, which we're initially saying is December 25th. It uses this when it comes down here, when it renders or gets around to rendering our function. So here it is. We have the class name, or a div, I should say, that says countdown to something, right? So this.state.deadline. At this point, when it first does it, it happens to be whatever we set it to in here. In this case, it's December 25th when we first load the page. Then there's the clock component, which we are sending our state of deadline, whatever it happens to be. At this point, it's still just the initial state. We're sending this state down to the clock component. So in this case, when it gets to here, it's called props, right? So we, similarly to the way we created our app component over here, in our new file, our clock.jsx, we created a new component called clock. And it has a constructor too, to add props to it. And it gets through super props. That's where it's going to get that this deadline equals this, that's that deadline. This is where it gets through. It comes through because we told it here when we are talking about our clock to expect this. We're attaching this to it, or binding it to it, I guess is the right term. So when we say this, that's where we get it from. So now we want to talk about this deadline. In this component, we talk about the deadline as state, but in this component, we're talking about it as deadline, this.props.deadline. That's why over here it's this.state.deadline, but here in the clock component it's this.props.deadline, because it was passed as props from its parent component. So what we're doing here, we got the form that says, okay, so this is the input box there, right? And this is just saying on change event. So this changes every time we hit a key, whether or not we hit the submit or not. The new deadline event.target value, the new deadline property here, which really isn't doing anything yet, it's just an empty string. This is going to change all the time. Anytime we hit a key, this changes. We don't see that yet unless you're in the React tools. I noticed you can, if you're typing, that'll change dynamically. As you type in the input box, you can see this state changing. Okay, so nothing happens with that until you click the button. When you click the button, we're calling a function, an anonymous function in this case, which is this.changeDeadline, which is right here. Calling this.changeDeadline calls a function that is given to us, this.setState. This is a function that comes from the component, right? We didn't have to write that. It's a method on the component, right, that's given to us. So we call this.setState. And the information that we're giving to that is we're changing the deadline from our initial value to whatever happened to be in new deadline we were, like I said before, we're typing this changes all the time. Whenever we hit a button, this changes. So whatever it happens to be when we click this button now becomes a new deadline, or let me back up. When we're clicking away, this is changing. Whatever we stop on there and click the button, that value then becomes the new deadline right here. Deadline is this state, that new deadline. And we have to do it this way because one of the rules of React is you can't just say state deadline equals. You have to do it through a function. I'm not sure I understand why you have to do it that way, but for now I think it's okay to just say that's the rule. Just you have to do it that way. Okay, so then fine, we're over here in the, let's talk about the clock. So we got that deadline. It's going to change. Okay, so when that happens, not only does it change this countdown to whatever, that is also passed down to the clock as a prop, right? So now over here we can call this .props.deadline and get that value, right? So these, what do we have here? Component will mount, component did mount. This is just the helper function to get the zeros so the screen doesn't look bouncy. Okay, so we have here, when we return this clock function, it's basically just saying, this is just the days, hours, minutes, and seconds. Where's it getting that from? Okay, it's getting that from... Alright, so the state of this is 0, 0, 0, 0. We defined those when we first created this. Alright, days, hours, minutes, and seconds. Why does that change? Because it changes because when we first render this, just before it renders it, it does component will mount, and it says this get time until, which is a function that we created here, and it's a function, and we're going to give it this .props.deadline, which came from the stuff we were doing back here. So we call get time until deadline with the passing in the deadline, right? So, and all this stuff does is say the difference in time between our deadline and the new date. New date is a function that's just in JavaScript. You call new date and it gives you the time and date right now, whenever you call it. So the difference between that and the deadline is the amount of time that we have left to count down. These are just to make them look not like milliseconds, and we have to call this .set state days, hours, minutes, and seconds to change our state, because we can't just say state equals. You have to do it by calling a function. And again, this .set state is a function that's given to us through the component, right? So it's a method on component. And since the clock extends the component, we get the set state method. So this changes our days, hours, and minutes display, so to speak, because the component will mount is what happens just before it's rendered. So it checks this and says, okay, what's the deadline? Oh, no, it doesn't say that. It says run this function, get time until, and so it displays that. And instead of our zeros, we did this calculations to be to figure out these values, and it pops those into here in the actual display. Okay, so then it finishes displaying. Component did mount is what happens. Is a method that's given to us that says when. Okay, fine. We put this stuff on the screen. Our component is done. So we're telling it when it gets to that point, the component is done rendering. Do this function, which is, we told it set interval, which means do this other function in this case every 1,000 mils every second, right? That's how we're getting our counter to count down by seconds. And we're saying this dot get time until, which is this thing that we did before, with this dot props dot deadline, which is the same thing we did here. So we're saying at the beginning of the function, do this, and then at the end of the function, figure it out again, right? But wait a second. Wait 1 second and do it again. And because this gets a new state from this, it has to re-render. So when it re-renders, it goes through this whole thing again. Get timeout until, and fills in this information. Which just keeps happening. And I noticed that if you put in a date that has already passed, it will start giving you negative numbers. So this is basically kind of like an infinite loop, but it's not enough to, not like a loop, like a JavaScript loop, like you get when you're taking a JavaScript class and you crash your browser. But I mean, it just keeps happening. And I think that's all there is to it. I have this stopwatch thing over here because I started working on that, but for this purpose of this, it doesn't do anything. I'd love to hear anybody's input on this to tell me whether it makes sense or whether the way I described it is accurate and makes sense. Thanks, David, for the class. I'm really enjoying it. I gave your other ES6 class a 5-star rating. Yeah, great job. I'm looking forward to finishing this course. Thanks.